If God doesn't exist, why does anything have meaning at all? Why is love beautiful? Why is truth worth pursuing? Why is murder objectively wrong? Most people think these questions are separate, but they're not. They're all connected by one foundation, and if that foundation doesn't exist, neither do the answers. If God doesn't exist, nothing matters. If he does exist, the universe has a whole new meaning, reality, and purpose. So, does he? Today, I'm going to make what I believe is one of the strongest cases for the existence of the Christian God. And the first point I want to look at is possibly the most devastating for the atheist: cosmology, or how did the universe begin? I'm sure you've heard of the Big Bang, when the universe exploded into being from what's called the singularity, a tiny point of hot, dense matter that exploded and rapidly expanded into the universe. An unfortunately large number of Christians have the wrong assumption that, as I like to put it, the atheists own the Big Bang, that it's proof for atheism. This couldn't be more wrong. The Big Bang is the most devastating scientific discovery for the atheist worldview in all history. Why? Because it shows that the universe had a beginning. This immediately raises a plethora of questions. Where did it come from? Was there anything before it? How did it come into existence? Did something create it? If so, what or who was it? Atheism has never been able to, and still cannot answer the questions surrounding this scientific breakthrough. And that is why the Big Bang is not owned by the atheists, but rather by the Christians. The Big Bang has become some of the strongest proof for the existence of God. In fact, it underlies one of the strongest arguments for God's existence. The first premise of this argument is that the universe had a beginning. Second, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Third, therefore the universe had a cause. This is known as the Kalam argument, mainly constructed and put together by William Lane Craig. And this argument is instrumental in demonstrating the existence of God. You might ask, all this shows is that the universe had a cause, but how does that get you to God? Let's look at the attributes or powers that this cause needs to have. This cause must be spaceless to create a universe bound by space, timeless to create a universe bound by time, immaterial to create a material universe, and finally all-powerful and all-knowing to create something as magnificent as our universe. Have anybody in mind? You see, when you look at the powers this being would have to possess, they are all attributes of the being that, in the words of Augustine, all men call God. But a mere beginning isn't enough. The universe began with impossible precision. Once we realize that the universe had a cause, it naturally leads us to the next question: fine-tuning. Why is the universe so precisely calibrated for life? If atheism is true, and we truly are no more than mere chance, why would the universe be so precise? Life would be impossible without these dials set to the perfect parameters. An inch off in life is impossible. British astronomer Fred Hoyle famously said, "A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature." If that's what it appears to be, then isn't that what it is? If atheism denies it, then atheism is no longer the neutral position for enlightened ones that is based on empirical data and research. It's a position that denies explicit empirical evidence because it has presuppositions that must be upheld. Like said before, the physical constants that are necessary for life are balanced on a knife edge, slightly off, and life is impossible. Here's some examples of what I'm referring to. The speed of light is a physical constant that is crucial to life. If it were slightly faster, matter would become unstable, and atoms, which are essential to life, would break apart more easily. If it were just a tiny bit slower, stars would burn through their fuel much faster, making life impossible. It's set at the perfect spot, and if it weren't, life would be impossible. But it is. Why? That is not something atheism can answer. If we truly are no more than mere chance, the probability of mere chance producing around 30 of these intricate, extremely precise constants is so low, it is practically impossible. The gravitational constant is another one of the 30 that are crucial to life. If it were slightly stronger, stars would burn out in a few million years instead of billions. If it were a little bit weaker, on the other hand, planets, stars, and galaxies could never clump together and form, which again are essential for life. This is yet another example of a physical constant that is crucial to life. And if it was barely off, it would destroy all possibility of all living organisms. Imagine a set of dials floating in space, each set to incredibly precise and intricate parameters. That is an accurate representation of all 30 constants. That is not a kind of intelligence that comes from matter. That kind of intelligence only comes from minds. We've seen how the universe had to have a cause, and how the universe this cause created is perfectly designed for life. But wait until you see how perfectly designed for life the actual life is. The next question I want to look at is this: DNA. Where did the information in DNA come from? This is one of those questions that most people never stop to ask, but once you actually see it, it's almost impossible to unsee. DNA is a digital code, a language. It stores the instructions for building every living thing on this planet, using a 4-letter alphabet: A, T, C, and G. The amount of information packed into a single cell is incredible. If you tried to write it all out, it would fill thousands of encyclopedia volumes. Here's the problem for the atheist. In all our time gathering empirical data and observation, information only comes from intelligence. You see, every single time we see a code, a language, a set of instructions in our everyday experience, it comes from a mind. No one looks at a book and says this must have formed by chance, or looks at software and says random processes wrote this program. You're not going to look at this video that you're watching right now and assume that this is mere chance producing it. You're going to assume that there is intelligence behind it. Yet when it comes to DNA, the most sophisticated information system we know of, many people suddenly become willing to believe that mindless chance did it. This is complete dishonesty. They are choosing to ignore the evidence right before their eyes. One of the co-founders of DNA, Francis Crick, decided that DNA was so complex that it was impossible for chance to have created it. And keep in mind, he was a former atheist. He decided to believe in what's known as panspermia, the view that aliens seeded life on Earth. But again, we then have to examine the attributes or powers that this alien would have. And when you see that this being must be all-powerful, all-knowing, intelligent, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and more, you're just naming God by another name. Random natural processes do not create complex, specified information that details everything about you. Whether you have brown hair, blue eyes, whether you're 6'1" or 5'3". Mutation in natural selection can only work with information that already exists. They cannot create the original code. So the question remains, where did the information in DNA come from? Atheism has no answer. The only explanation that actually fits what we observe is that it came from an intelligent mind. The past few arguments have been based on scientific arguments, things that we can observe. However, this one may hit harder than all the previous or future arguments, and that's because it deals with things that we see, feel, and experience every single day. Things that cause us to react emotionally, not intellectually, good and bad. Specifically, the moral argument. How do you account for objective moral duties? We all know some things are truly wrong. When you hear about a child being abused, or innocent people being slaughtered, or the powerful crushing the weak, or you're reading a fiction story in which the forces of good and evil are fighting each other, something rises up inside you. You don't just think, I personally don't like that. You know it is wrong, objectively wrong. Not based on culture or opinion, wrong in a way that applies to everyone. We root for the good guy in the story, not because we like him better, but because we have an inner craving for justice, something screaming inside us that for justice to be done that cannot be materially explained. But if atheism is true, if we are nothing more than accidental bags of meat in a purposeless universe, then where do these moral duties come from? Matter doesn't care about justice. As I like to say, Mother Nature could care less about you. The universe doesn't care about right and wrong. All it cares about is survival. You see, evolution might explain why we feel certain things are bad for survival, but it can't make those feelings into real, binding, moral obligations. Here's this argument syllogised simply. If God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. But objective morality does exist. Therefore, God exists. This is the moral argument, and it is devastating for the atheist worldview because every time an atheist says, that's wrong, they are borrowing from a foundation they claim doesn't exist. In other words, they are assuming God exists to argue that God does not exist. That's what we call intellectual hypocrisy. They are hypocritically arguing against God while using the tools that are grounded upon him. When they say God can't exist because of all the injustice in the world, they are relying on his existence in order to even argue against it. C.S. Lewis said this in his book, Mere Christianity. My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? This is a fantastic example. You can't call a line crooked if you don't have some idea of a straight line. What is the atheist straight line by which they judge crooked lines or evil? I'll let you in on a little secret. they don't have one. Some say it's evolution, some say it's society, some say it's love for others, but every supposed explanation fails under scrutiny when faced with the question, why is that objectively good? Atheism cannot account for morality without God. But morality isn't the only thing that's dependent on God and seems to transcend the physical. So does the way that we think, or reason and logic. The question, how do you account for the existence and reliability of reason and logic? Logic is immaterial. You cannot see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, or hear it. You can't put it under a microscope or buy it at Walmart. Yet it is universal and binding. The law of non-contradiction does not care where you live or what culture you come from. Something cannot be true and false at the same time, and that holds everywhere, without denial. If atheism is true and our minds are just the product of blind evolutionary processes, then why should we trust them? Evolution selects for survival, not for truth. If a false belief helped our ancestors stay alive longer, evolution would favor that false belief. So why should we trust our reasoning when it starts making claims about the nature of reality, morality, or God? Take this example. A caveman develops the belief that every time, without fail, when he hears a rustle in the woods, it is a saber-toothed tiger interested in him for lunch. As a result of this false adaptation, every time he hears a rustle in the woods, he flees like a saber-toothed tiger is after him. Is this belief true? No. Most of the time it is probably not a saber-toothed tiger out to eat him. Definitely not 100% of the time. And yet he believes it, and as a result runs for his life every single time. However, maybe 30% of the time, it is a saber-toothed tiger hungry for some caveman, and running for his life ends up saving his life. Natural selection sees that this is an adaptation that helps the human survive, and therefore it begins to evolve into humans until they all have this false belief that is helpful for survival. Why can't reason be the same? Why can't it be a false belief that is helpful for survival? That is not a question that the atheist can provide a legitimate answer to. They cannot prove it, they cannot trust it, they cannot guarantee it. Now let me anticipate a question that may have been raised by this argument. Why is it so essential for reason to be a true adaptation in us? Because we use reason to determine things such as whether someone lives or dies. A judge has to use reason. A ruler has to use reason. We depend on reason for things every day, decisions such as most of the time when people go to the bad side of town, they get robbed. Therefore, because I don't want to go get robbed, I won't go to the bad side of town. If we cannot trust reason, then the very concepts of knowledge, wisdom, and discernment, they are all impossible. Atheism cannot ground logic without borrowing from a theistic worldview. The atheist has to use the very tools that only make sense if a rational mind stands behind reality. This is what Christians have pointed out again and again. The unbeliever must stand on Christian ground in order to even argue against Christianity. And as said before, that is what we call intellectual hypocrisy. The next question we need to ask is, if logic itself points beyond the material world, then what about the deepest question of existence, or the ontological argument? Does the idea of a greatest possible being require that God exists? Yes, it does. This one is more abstract, but it is extremely powerful. God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, the being than which nothing greater can be thought. Now, existence in reality is obviously greater than existence only in the mind, which means God who exists only as an idea is not as great as God who actually exists. Therefore, if the concept of God as the greatest possible being is coherent, then God must exist in reality. If he didn't, he wouldn't be the greatest possible being. This forces a serious question. Can the idea of a perfect, necessary being really be nothing more than a human invention? Or does the very concept point to something real? This argument is not something to be waved away as meaningless philosophical discussion. There is no legitimate objection that has been raised to the ontological argument, though many have tried. The more you think about this argument, the more you realize it holds significant weight. It is not an argument to be ignored. We were talking about existence, but the next part proves that if God doesn't exist, existence can't be proven to be any more than a delusion. Consciousness. How does consciousness arise from non-conscious matter? Matter by itself is not conscious. You can describe every chemical reaction in the brain, every neuron firing, every electrical impulse, and still not explain the subjective experience of being you. The feeling of seeing the color red, the experience of joy or pain, the inner life that no one else can fully access. We can point to each specific part of the brain with its specific task. We cannot point to the part of the brain which contains our consciousness. If we cannot observe it with our senses, then it must be immaterial. And as a reminder, atheism cannot account for anything immaterial. This is called the hard problem of consciousness, and materialism has never solved it. You cannot get mind from pure mindless matter. The best explanation is that consciousness comes from a conscious mind, a mind that existed before any physical brain. In a universe that begins with an intelligent mind, we should expect consciousness. In a universe that begins with no minds, just matter, we shouldn't expect it at all. We've now constructed a case for the existence of God that cannot be denied. We began by showing the universe had to have a cause, then showed that the necessary cause was God. We then moved to the properties of the universe and showed how it requires God in order to be so intricately designed for life. Then we demonstrated how the life itself is so complex that pure chance in nature could not have created it. Next, we moved to more philosophical arguments to prove, first, that our moral intuition requires God as a standard. Second, that the existence and reliability of reason and logic requires a mind transcendent above creation to be grounded upon, like God's. Third, that as the greatest possible being, the only option for God is to exist. And finally, that the knowledge of existence itself is impossible if we cannot rely upon God as our foundation for intelligibility. But even if all those arguments could be disproved, there is one left that isn't actually an argument. It's just having common sense. This is called Pascal's wager, invented by Blaise Pascal. It goes somewhat like this. Basically, what do you have to lose in believing in God's existence? If you believe in you're wrong, you lose nothing of eternal value. If you believe in you're right, you gain everything. If you reject God and you're wrong, you lose everything. This is not a proof by itself. It's a rational response to the weight of the evidence already presented. And when this case is strong, refusing to believe is clinging to your presuppositions with no evidence at all. Psalm 19:1 says that the heavens declare the glory of God. We've demonstrated exactly that. Reason, logic, morality, fine-tuning, and more are all things that wouldn't make sense in a universe not created by God. You see, even the devil believes God exists. So my final question is, why don't you?